Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 190 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Christopher Buckley, author of such satirical novels as Little Green Men, Boomsday, and Supreme Courtship. His novel Thank You for Smoking was adapted into a 2005 film starring Aaron Eckhart. Buckley is also the author of Losing Mom and Pup, a memoir about the death of his parents, socialite Patricia Buckley and conservative commentator William F. Buckley. Christopher Buckley's new novel The Relic Master is his first foray into historical fiction, and describes a madcap scheme by Albrecht Dürer to forge the Shroud of Turin. And now, here's our interview with Christopher Buckley. All right, so we're here with Christopher Buckley. Welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so I first became a fan of yours back in college when I came across your book Little Green Men, which obviously caught my eye as a science fiction fan. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about how that book came about.
Well, that was a book about a stuffy Washington pundit. Imagine such a creature existing as a stuffy Washington pundit who becomes the victim of a secret government program to foster belief in UFOs, so as to promote space programs and weapons programs. And this program is run out of the basement of the agriculture department or the Social Security Administration. You know, this is a guy who doesn't really have much to do, who drinks too much, and he's pissed off because he hasn't been promoted, and he arranges for fake alien abductions. And anyway, so one night he sees this. He's in a bad mood because his latest promotion has been turned down yet again. And he's watching this stuffy Washington pundit on TV being stuffy. And he thinks, okay, you're next. So instead of, the type of person who typically says he or she has been abducted by aliens, impregnated by aliens, probed by aliens, this very respectable, if stuffy, guy is on the golf course at Burning Tree, the establishment golf course in Washington. And he is abducted by government agents dressed up as aliens. Next thing he knows, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing at my own jokes, but he wakes up and he's inside, what looks like a spaceship, and he is being probed most intimately by Little Green Men. And it sort of changes his life. He goes from, this is a guy, they call them, excuse me, in Washington, we have a lovely term for people who run the Sunday morning political talk shows. We call them the Sabbath day gas bags. Anyway, this is a guy who has his own show. And so now, he gets to interview presidents and prime ministers. And now, instead of talking about, relations with Russia or relations with England, all they can talk about is UFOs. He becomes obsessed. So he has, the president of the United States on his program, who's expecting to, be asked questions about deficit reduction and such. And instead his is asked by this guy, what the what the government knows about UFOs. But I became I became I did a lot of research into this, and I am not a believer myself in UFOs, but it fascinates me that many Americans are. Roughly, the statistic is roughly it's about 75% of Americans either believe in or suspect that the government is hiding things from us. The famous Area 51 phenomenon. That's about the same number as believe that JFK was killed in a conspiracy, that Lee Harvey Oswald was not acting alone. So I became fascinated by the belief in these things, and I proceeded from there. And in the course of researching the book, I went to a number of UFO conventions. Now, you as a science fiction writer may have attended these. If you have, they are full of very interesting people, and it can make for quite an exciting weekend, a UFO convention.
Did any of those people read your book? How was it received among them?
This was, the book, David, came out sort of I won't say pre-internet. It came out about, 96, 97, but it was just on the cusp. I mean, we didn't have social media then. We didn't have the extraordinary communication matrices that we have now. So I wasn't, today I would probably be deluged with, with emails. I didn't really particularly take a position on UFOs, pro or con. My book was a satire on the world of UFOs, and it offered an explanation for UFO sightings. It essentially said, yeah, the government is actually behind this, but they're creating it. And there are two epigraphs in Little Green Man. And one is from a memoir by this guy named Miles Copeland. And he was CIA in the early 40s and 50s. He was something of a legend. And this was a quote from his, I don't have it in front of me, but this was a quote from his memoir. And he said that we put out word to throw the Soviets off balance. We put out disinformation that UFOs existed. And he said, and it worked. It did throw them off balance. But he said, we also inadvertently created a whole cult of people who, thought, oh my God, these are true. The second epigraph was from a story in USA Today. It was a quote by a guy named Webster Hubbell, and you may, some of your diligent older listeners may remember him as the number 2 Attorney General in the first Bill Clinton administration. And he said, this quote goes something like this. He said, when Bill Clinton became president, he pulled me in to his office, and he said to me, Webb, or maybe he called him Hub, there's 2 things I want you to find out for me. One, who killed Kennedy? And are UFOs real? And I thought, wow, he was, the president of the United States. So I used those as the epigraphs to Little Green Men.
All right, great. Yeah. So, why don't you tell us about your new book, The Relic Master? How'd you come up with that one?
Well, the Relic Master is about a 16th century relic dealer. There was a booming trade in them. This was about the time that the Catholic Church was busy hawking indulgences, which if you bought, the idea was you could buy time off from your sentence in purgatory. And holy relics, the knuckle bone of Saint Jerome, or the clavicle of Saint Teresa, et cetera, or the fingernail from Saint Cyprian, were very much a part of the indulgence trade. How I had not given much thought to this before, but one day I was surfing the web, as you young people would say, and I was doing a short magazine piece on listicles. We have an obsession now in the media for lists. 17 reasons why Caitlyn Jenner should have, there were 17 new outfits for Caitlyn Jenner, whatever. And I came across this sort of tantalizing detail that there was a guy in the early 16th century named Frederick of Saxony who had a collection of holy relics numbering 19,012. And I thought, I want to know more about this guy.
Well, yeah, and I mean, when you started looking into this whole relic business that you describe in the book, did it shock you how cynical and corrupt everything was, or were you kind of used to it after observing Washington for so long?
It's I was the product of a Catholic education, so I knew a certain amount about church history. I can't say I was particularly shocked. Everyone knows about the indulgence trade. The indulgence trade back then had, you could say, certain legitimate aims. I mean, it's how St. Peter's Basilica in Rome was largely built from with the proceeds of indulgence sales. Now you can take the position, oh, well, now we have a great basilica, so that was all for the good. Or you could take the position with, how awful that a lot of people spent their life savings buying these indulgences just to give popes a palace to live in. So I wasn't particularly surprised by what I found. What I found was a sort of a fun playground to work in.
I mean, did you embellish this at all, or did things like you quote this guy Johann Tetzel as saying that his indulgences could free a man from purgatory even if he had ravished the Virgin?
That is absolutely factual. I didn't alter any historical facts. This is the first time I've attempted historical fiction. And I think historical fiction I'm about to say something very obvious. It's fiction, but it has to be historical. I couldn't, if I wrote a book saying that, King Henry VIII cut off the heads of all 6 of his wives, you would probably and legitimately go, wait a minute, wasn't it actually 2 wives? So those. I altered no historical fact, but I created a character at the very center of this, Dismas, my Relic Master, and made up the action of that plot. But the real people in the book, Frederick of Saxony, who was Martin Luther's employer and protector, the Cardinal Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz, Paracelsus, the great doctor in Basel, Switzerland, whom we can thank for having brought opium back from from the East. He was therefore he could be called the father of modern anesthesiology. The various dukes and a pope and another Italian duke, they're all real people, and I altered no factual detail.
Because you mentioned that among Frederick's relic collection was the Holy Prepuce, which is the circumcised foreskin of Jesus.
Yes.
You said that there were actually 12 of these floating around at the time.
I'm glad you brought that up, David, because it's not every day one gets to talk about the Holy Prepuce. And I don't irreverently, but I read in the course of researching this book a scholarly monograph on the subject of the 12 holy prepuces of Jesus that were said to exist in the Middle Ages. There were this was the circumcised foreskin of the infant Jesus, and there were 12 churches and monasteries that claimed to have the real one, and Frederick indeed had one.
So at the time, if you told people that you had Jesus's foreskin, what percentage of the population would believe you?
Well, that's the interesting question. It's a little bit like the UFO question. Okay, here's this guy, Frederick of Saxony, the guy with this collection of 19,000 relics. This was an educated, smart, and good man. Who just had a passion for collecting relics. Now, among the relics, his relics were, a nail from the crucifixion, the lance of Longinus. That's the tip of the lance that the Roman soldier lanced Jesus' side with the end of the crucifixion to finish him off. He had a mummified body of one of the holy innocents. These were remember the 2,000 babies that Herod ordered slaughtered, so that after he heard that there was a savior had been born. Now, so let's ask ourselves: did someone called Frederick the Wise, did he actually believe these things were real? Well, maybe yes, maybe not. His longer view, if you want to look at it that way, was that if maybe this or that relic wasn't real, but if relics made people pious and inspired them to be good, where was the harm? But I have a hard time believing that he thought every one of his relics was actually real.
Right. And so this book is centrally concerned with the Shroud of Turin. How did you come up with the idea to write about that?
Well, the Shroud of Turin is, I think, safe to say, it is the fascinating artifact. The Shroud of Turin, just to recap, is the piece of linen that is said to have been the burial shroud of Jesus. It bears the likeness of a man who has been horribly tortured and crucified and then put in this shroud. It has been documented back to the mid-14th century. It is now in Turin. It has been in Turin, Italy, since the 16th century. The church has never taken the position that it was real. Then in 1988, the church agreed to have it tested independently by three physics laboratories. One, the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena. Another, I think a microbiology lab in Oxford, England. And then there was a third one, I forget where. So, and among the tests that were done was a carbon-14 test, which, as you know, is a pretty accurate way of dating The results of the test show that the shroud dated to between 1290 AD and 1360 AD. Okay, so it could not have been the actual burial shroud of Christ, although science cannot explain how this remarkable artifact was in fact produced, because to produce it as accurately as it was produced, its maker would have had to know certain scientific facts that weren't known until the 20th century. Anyway, the church in 1988 then declared it to be a fake. They stepped forward and said, okay, it's a forgery. But they said, however, we believe it is worthy of veneration as an icon. And the church further attributed various miracles to it, miracles of healing, people who prayed or made a pilgrimage to the shroud and were mysteriously healed. So it took, the church takes what you might call a highly nuanced position with respect to the shroud. But and there are a lot of people who still believe that it is genuine. It's a little bit like UFOs, David. There's just people who want to believe in this. So they say, the testing was flawed, and some of these people make very good arguments that indeed the testing was flawed. In the book, I take no position as to its authenticity. I personally don't think it is authentic, but I think it is fascinating.
Well, but how about this idea that the shroud was forged by Albrecht Dürer? Is that something you came up with?
That's mine. I was in the course of I tend to build my books, my stories from the bottom up, kind of brick by brick. I'm not what you call a terribly inspired writer, so I just sort of put pieces together one by one. And in the course of researching the book, I was thinking, okay, who else was? I knew I wanted it to be set in 1517, which was the date that Martin Luther initiated the Protestant Reformation by nailing his theses to the cathedral door in Wittenberg. So I was thinking, well, who else is alive at that time? And one of the people who was very prominently alive was the great painter Albrecht Dürer. And there's a famous he may. One of the fascinating things about Dürer, he may have invented the selfie. Until he started doing self-portraits, he did his first one when he was 13, artists didn't do self-portraits. They were painting the crucifixion or the Sermon on the Mount or whatever. They weren't, looking in the mirror and painting themselves. And on the back of the book, you'll see his famous self-portrait of 1500. And I had been staring at the Turin shroud, and I found what to me seemed like an extraordinary similarity between the face of the man in the shroud and this self-portrait by Dürer. And that was my, if you want to call it, my aha moment.
Well, right, because he's a marvelous character in the book because he's so self-absorbed, and he actually does paint himself as Jesus. It does seem sort of plausible.
He and Dismas, my Relic Master, and Dürer are best friends. They're buddies. Dismas is a former Swiss mercenary who gave up being a mercenary when he took part in a famous battle, which was the first battle in history that was determined by gunpowder. He took one look at this gunpowder thing and said, I'm out of here. I'm going into a different line of work. And Dürer is the sort of high-strung artist who's very narcissistic. And Dismas is always teasing him about that. He said, Dürer not only painted a lot of self-portraits, but he also would, if he was doing a painting of something that had nothing to do with him, he would insert himself in it somewhere. It was kind of like a "Where's Waldo?" Where's Alfred? So Dismas's nickname for him is Nars, from Narcissus, the character in Greek mythology who was always staring at himself in his reflection in a puddle of water.
So also, I just have to ask, to what extent do you think that constipation played a role in the Protestant Reformation?
I don't think it played any role at all. Catholics, hardcore Catholics, like to take the one of their arguments against Luther was that he was just a grouchy, constipated guy. This, if only there had been X-lax argument, there would have been no Protestant Reformation. I think that's a silly way of looking at it. Luther was a very ascetic Augustinian monk. He was at the time that he launched his great protest against Rome, and specifically the sale of indulgences. He was a lean, hard monk who was ate one crust of bread per day, and then felt guilty that he was overindulging. So he launches this protest, which becomes more and more intense. And Frederick of Saxony, who employed Luther as his chief doctor of theology at his university in Wittenberg, protected Luther. But now you have to consider every religious dissident of that era ended up burned at the stake or decapitated. How is it that Martin Luther, who attacked the Pope, called him the Antichrist and the whore of Babylon and all sorts of names, how did he survive? Well, the answer was Frederick. Frederick protected him. And after Luther was denounced, Frederick, to protect him further, arranged for a fake kidnapping and hid him away in one of his castles, marvelously named Wartburg. Luther was under a kind of protective house arrest for, I think, 6, 7, 8, 9 months. And yes, he was constipated. I think I'd have been too. Consider what the what the diet in those days was. Okay, so he was constipated. He was under a lot of stress. How did he pass his time at Wartburg? By translating the New Testament from Greek into vernacular German. And he had such an extraordinary ability at language. He could render Greek text into emotionally charged, plain, energetic prose that even a German peasant could understand. This document, later he translated the rest of the Bible, and scholars consider this to be the founding document of the modern German language. So you can be interested in Luther's constipation, but I think it's far more interesting to be interested in what Luther accomplished while he was constipated.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that you were raised Catholic, and I've seen in interviews that you don't consider yourself Catholic anymore. Could you just talk about what impact that had on this book?
Well, the book is not an anti-religious book. Every fact that I adduce in the book about the church at the time is historically based. I didn't make up the fact that Pope Leo X, who completely botched the church management up in Germany to the extent that Luther, launched his great protest. I didn't make up the fact that he was an obese hedonist voracious and, shall we say, however you consider it, but at the time they were considered unnatural sexual proclivities. I didn't make up the fact that he, held banquets at the, that would have made Petronius blush. I didn't make up the fact that he had a pet albino elephant named Hanno, that he spent so lavishly on his own pleasures, banqueting, hunting, and such, that he left the church bankrupt upon his death. So, I'm not, that's not me inventing that. But I've had some very angry letters from the monks at Portsmouth Abbey, where I went 4 years at boarding school, who were furious with me about the book. And they say, one of them said, "You have shown the bride of Christ at its worst." To which I would, I think, humbly reply, if I wanted to show the bride of Christ at its worst, I would have written or directed the movie that is currently out called Spotlight. If you want to talk about the worst of the Catholic Church, I think you have to look no farther than our own time, when the Church covered up pedophilia scandals among the clergy on a vast and repugnant scale. And not only in America, but in everywhere. Ireland, Germany, Italy. I mean, I think by contrast, my my book is a love tap.
I was curious actually what you thought of Spotlight, but was the sexual abuse, was that not going on in the 1500s?
Oh, I'm sure it was. I don't. There's no. I've never come across documentation of it, but it would have been probably dangerous to document, and there would have been no recourse anyway. It was. I think the real scandals were probably otherwise, but no. I mean, I'm sure. I'm sure there were. I'm sure that was probably going on, but it would have there would have been no authority to report it or contain it. Human nature is human nature. Human nature doesn't change. The sins of the Romans are still practiced. The sins of the Greek, these excesses. But I don't know. I to your question, I don't actually know how widespread those abuses were, but they would be repugnant in any age, wouldn't they?
I mean, I'm pretty critical of religion on this show, and I really enjoyed the book "God Is Not Great" by Christopher Hitchens.
Yes, I did too. He was a great friend of mine.
Yeah, I saw in your bio that you actually connected him with your editor who published that book.
I did. I mean, it was simply, Christopher, here's John, here's Christopher. And they carried the ball forward from there. It wasn't as though I, had to convince John Carp to publish Christopher. But his book had a huge impact, as you know. It became indeed a certified publishing phenomenon. It was number one on the New York Times list for a long time. And so I went to one of Christopher's talks or readings at Union Square in New York, and they were to say it was standing room only would be an understatement. They were bringing in books for him to sign, practically on pallets that were carried by forklifts. At my own book signings, I'm lucky to sell 4 or 5 books. I think he must have sold. Well, he certainly sold out the stock. I miss him. I miss him a lot.
It really seems like since he died that there's been this big backlash against him. Could you comment on that as someone who knew him well?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by backlash against him. What are you?
People sort of try to paint him as a warmonger, kind of.
Oh, I think that's. I don't think I wouldn't call that a backlash. I'm sure that a lot of people disagreed with him on that. He was Christopher was, as a lot of great men, great men are, um, might appear, to have had a contradictory career trajectory. When I first knew Christopher in the 70s and 80s, and even a little bit into the 90s, he was, to the left of Karl Marx. And, I knew him for over 35 years. And then he changed, at least in certain regards. I don't think his economic views significantly changed, but there were 2 events I can point to that made him a champion in the war against radical Islam. One was the fatwa that was waged against his great friend Salman Rushdie in when was it 1989, when Salman published his novel the Satanic Verses, and the Ayatollah Khomeini put a price on his head and said any Muslim who dispatches this infidel will get 72 virgins and a 6-pack of Miller Lite. And Christopher was appalled by that, and then of course 9/11. Anyway, so Christopher became ardently belligerent on the subject of the need to wage counter holy war against these people. But his books and his words will go on. He left us a wealth of by which to remember him. His most recent book came out just a couple of months ago, though Christopher's been dead going on 5 years now. Another collection of his essays called And Yet. And I believe it's on the bestseller lists. So I don't know that if there's been a backlash against Christopher, it doesn't seem to be working.
There was actually a line in The Relic Master that kind of reminded me of Christopher Hitchens. You can tell me what you think of that, but you're talking about Saint Boniface, who introduced Christianity to Germany.
Yeah.
And one of the characters says of him, "There was an oak tree that the Franks worshipped, sacred to Thor their god. To show that he did not fear the wrath of Thor, Boniface took an axe and chopped it down. In the end, they cut him into pieces, but now no one here worships Thor."
Yes, that's a true story. I just rendered it in my own words. Substitute God, the word Thor for God, and I suppose there you have it. It's a wonderful legend. I think that story is largely true too.
There was one other thing in your bio I wanted to ask you about. You say that he is surely not the first to point out that satire is another way of being serious. Do you think that satire and humor will ever be considered quote unquote serious in literary circles?
Probably not. I created a collection of essays a couple of years ago called "But Enough About You," and I used as an epigraph something I found by Somerset Maugham, great English writer, and it goes like this. Make the reader laugh, and he will consider you a trivial fellow, but bore him in just the right way, and your success is assured. I think now this is a blanket statement, and have at me if you disagree. I'm sure a lot of people might, but I think humor, satire, comedy, what call it what you will, in a metaphorical sense, sort of sits at the children's table. I I don't think that's quite fair, but I think we sort of have to live with it. Um, if you were to, I mean, how many, and let me emphasize, I'm not comparing myself to Shakespeare, but how many of Shakespeare's comedies are considered, well, put it another way. I think we largely remember Shakespeare for his tragedies, not his comedies. Some of his comedies are very good. They didn't particularly work for me, but we remember Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Macbeth, King Lear, rather than Much Ado About Nothing or As You Like It. If you go through the canon of Western literature, not many of the iconic books, the great masterpieces. I think would you consider satire or comic? And yet, you have Gulliver's Travels, which is a satire, and that endures. You have Huckleberry Finn, which could be a comedy, but you could also, I mean, it's something much larger than that. The general point I'm making is, I guess, Somerset Maugham. But I will quickly add that the author Christopher Hitchens, most revered, was P.G. Wodehouse, creator of Bertie and Jeeves. He called him the master. And Christopher is hardly alone in that. So maybe, I don't know, maybe I undercut my own argument here.
Well, I mean, most of your other novels are contemporary satires. And I think people seem to have this idea that politics has just become degraded in recent years and things used to be so much more dignified in the past. And obviously the Relic Master shows that not to be the case. How do you think that politics today and maybe in the coming years compares to how degraded it's been throughout history?
Well, we tend to get a little bit up on our high horses and snooty about the current state of politics being degraded. I think in the age of Trump, it's very degraded. However, that's different from saying politics used to be cleaner and more high-minded. You can go back and read things that were said about Abraham Lincoln. Newspaper columnists or writers calling him he was called a baboon, so that wasn't exactly a kinder and gentler time. The reason I went back 500 years and crossed the Atlantic and settled in the Holy Roman Empire was I kind of needed a break from political satire. I don't know how you do political satire today. Stephen Colbert does it brilliantly every night, but that's a TV show, which is different from what I do. I'm sure Saturday Night Live does it occasionally well too. But if I wrote a novel, David, in which I recapitulated verbatim everything that has happened in this current campaign cycle, if I created a character called Donald Rump, say, and quoted verbatim, had him quote verbatim everything that Donald Trump has said, I'm not sure how convincing you would find that as satire. You'd probably say, "Oh, come on, this is over the top."
Okay, so one thing I really wanted to ask you is I saw you say in an interview that book tours are just horrible, that you compare them to torture, and
yeah, I did that honestly to be funny. There are great, as with anything, there are good moments in book tours, and then there are awful moments in book tours. The awful moments are, I did 10 cities in 10 days once, and, and you're exhausted, and you're with some AM radio talk jock who hasn't the faintest idea who you are, what your book is about, and those are the parts I could do without. Then there are, the moments where you connect with your readers, and that tends to happen. I found at small bookstores. So I love doing those where, the people who are in your audience, whether or not they're 10 people or 20 people or more, they want to be there. It's gratifying, when someone comes up and says, "Oh, my dad was in the hospital having chemo, so I brought him a book and it made him laugh." Those are the good times.
I mean, is there anything that could be done? Could book interviewers like me be doing anything differently to make book tours more enjoyable?
Well, you're doing just fine, but then my first my first rule is always butter up the interviewer. But this is a pleasure. I mean, having an hour to talk with an intelligent guy who's read the book and cares about it, and maybe read your other books. I suppose I could tell this story. Those about the author paragraphs on the back book flap that, it's the paragraph that authors sort of claim they didn't write, but it say David Kirtley is one of the greatest literary stars of his generation. His books have been translated into 5,000 languages, whatever. Well, after 5 or 6 books, I got a little bored, and so I started making them up, and I wrote one that he has been an advisor to every U.S. president since William Howard Taft, right? So, why not? So it's day 8 of a 10-day book tour, and I'm in Boston walking into an AM. It's an AM drive time coal radio show. This is at the lowest of the totem pole. At the top you have NPR or David Kirtley's podcast. At the bottom you have some ignoramus who has a radio show that is mostly about how the traffic is moving. And I walk in, and he's hunched over he's got the book open in front of him, and he's speed reading the about the author paragraph, right? And his brow is sort of beetling. He's looking at this, and he looks up at me, and he sort of he stares and says, "You were an advisor to William Howard Taft?" And it was day 8, and I was a bit punchy. I said, yeah, it was. And so he frowned, and he said, "Well, so we could talk about that on the show?" I said, yeah, we could talk about that. And we did. And I haven't been invited back on his show, but, it was worth it.
All right, well, I think that's a good note to end on, because unfortunately we're all out of time. So we've been speaking with Christopher Buckley, and his new book is called The Relic Master. So Christopher, thank you so much for joining us.
Very good chatting with you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Christopher Buckley for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Burrows101 in the UK, who writes, "Essential listening for lovers of SF, as well as fantasy and horror. Dedicated hosts and cracking interviews with all the big writers in the field, as well as interesting post-interview discussions." So big thanks again to Burrows101 for that great review. Special thanks as well to Paul Pablo Beckett, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I'd like to give a special thank you to Jason Venner, who just made a very generous contribution to the show via PayPal. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.